Nolan Fisk fired me on a Wednesday afternoon. Thursday morning, the production floor had no specification sheets. I told Nolan that would happen. I told him twice, in writing. When the Phillips 66 attorneys subpoenaed me 6 weeks later, I brought both emails. The first email was dated July 18, 2023. The recipient was Stuart Fisk, our Chief Executive Officer, with a copy to Carolyn Ray, our Information Technology Director. The subject line was Customer Specification Database, Continuity Risk. The body was 3 paragraphs. I wrote that the database I had been building since 2016 required administrator-level credentials currently held by me alone. I wrote that in the event of my departure, planned or unplanned, the database would lock the moment my credentials were revoked and would remain inaccessible until a new administrator was trained and credentialed, a process I estimated at 6 to 8 weeks. I wrote that the database held the engineering specifications for 147 active customer accounts, that 31 of those accounts had specifications that existed nowhere else in the company's record systems, and that I recommended migration to either our SAP Enterprise platform or a dedicated quality management system before the end of the calendar year. The email was discussed at a September 2023 budget meeting and deferred as not a current year capital priority. The second email was dated September 11, 2025. The recipient was Nolan Fisk, who had joined the company in April that year as Chief Revenue and Innovation Officer. The copy line listed Stuart Fisk and Carolyn Ray. The subject line was Customer Specification Database, Renewed Migration Request, Personnel Risk. The body was 4 paragraphs. I had updated the active account count to 173. I had updated the migration timeline to 8 to 12 weeks. I had been more explicit about what would happen if the migration was not completed before any personnel changes were made in the product development function. I wrote verbatim that the database will lock upon credential revocation and that production will have no specification sheet capability for all 37 major accounts until the system is restored, which cannot be done without my participation. Nolan responded 10 days later on the 21st of September. His response was 4 sentences. He wrote that the company was evaluating cloud-first alternatives to replace the database. He wrote that the system was part of our digital infrastructure review. He wrote that he would follow up after Q2 planning. There was no follow-up. I am 44 years old. I was born in Evansville, Indiana. In 1982, my father, Randy, operated chemical reactors at the Alcoa Warwick aluminum smelter in Newburgh for 28 years, until the day in 2016 when the plant idled its smelting line, and he took the early retirement package and went to work part-time at a hardware store on the west side. My mother, Pat, taught advanced placement chemistry at Harrison High School in Evansville for 30 years until she retired in 2020. They are both alive. They eat lunch together every Wednesday at a diner on First Avenue called the Acropolis, run by a Greek family who have known my mother since the year I was born. I went to Purdue University in West Lafayette for chemical engineering, class of 2004. I did not get a master's degree. I went straight to work as a process engineer at a specialty polymer formulator in Lafayette, where I spent 8 years writing the production protocols for high-temperature plastics that go into the underhood components of pickup trucks. In 2011, I earned my professional engineer's license in the state of Indiana chemical discipline. In February of 2012, at age 30, I joined Meridian Sealing Technologies in Evansville as a senior process engineer. Meridian was founded in 2002 by Stuart Fisk in a leased fabrication shop on Covert Avenue in Evansville's industrial district near the Ohio River. Stuart had been a sales engineer at a larger gasket manufacturer in Cincinnati. He had decided, at age 24, that the custom-engineered industrial gasket market in the Ohio Valley was being underserved. He raised $300,000 from his uncle's brother-in-law in Owensboro, bought a press and a die-cutting machine, hired 7 welders and a quality inspector, and started taking orders from regional power plants and refineries that needed gaskets the big national suppliers would not bother to bid on. By the time I joined Meridian in 2012, the company had 110 employees and was doing $22 million a year in revenue. By 2025, the company had 310 employees and was doing $87 million in revenue. Stuart still owned 60%. A private equity firm called Arbor Point Capital had bought 40% in 2019. Meridian makes custom-engineered industrial gaskets and sealing components, spiral wound metallic gaskets, non-metallic flat gaskets, ring-type joint seals. Our customers are petrochemical refineries, power generation facilities, chemical processing plants, and a handful of natural gas processing operators in the central United States. Our gaskets go into the flanged connections on high-pressure, high-temperature piping systems. When a Meridian gasket fails in service, the failure is not a customer relations problem. It is a safety event. A blown gasket on a Class 600 steam line at 650 degrees Fahrenheit is the kind of failure that puts people in a burn unit. We do not produce a gasket that does not match its specification sheet. The specification sheet is the only thing between a coil of metal stock in our die-cutting line and a piping connection on a refinery somewhere in Kentucky or Ohio or Illinois at 3 in the morning. In 2016, I was promoted to Director of Product Development and Process Engineering. The same year, I began building the customer specification database. The need was immediate. We had 3 separate legacy systems for tracking customer specifications. They produced conflicting records. A gasket would be quoted from one system, ordered from a second, and produced from a third, and the 3 would not always agree. The result was a steady drip of customer quality complaints and a handful of near-miss incidents where the wrong gasket was produced and only caught at the dock by our own quality inspector. I told Stuart in his office on a Tuesday morning in March of 2016 that we needed a unified database and that if no one else was going to build it, I would. He told me to do it on top of my regular work. I did. It took me 6 years. By the spring of 2022, the customer specification database had migrated all 3 legacy systems into a single unified environment running on a custom SQL and Microsoft Access platform. It held the complete engineering package for every active Meridian customer account: material grade, thickness tolerance, bore diameter, pressure class, temperature rating, surface finish per the relevant section of the gasket design standards, applicable test protocol, customer-specific shipping marks, and the change history of every revision since I had built the account. The database held 147 accounts in 2022. It held 173 accounts by 2025. It was what the production floor used every morning to generate the day's specification sheets. It was what quality control used to verify gaskets before shipment. It was what our sales team used to quote lead times and pricing on repeat orders. Without it, the production floor could not produce a custom gasket. They could produce stock products from the standard catalog. They could not produce a single custom order. My wife Karen and I have been married since 2009. We met at a Purdue alumni networking event in Indianapolis in 2006. She is a staff accountant at a small Evansville firm called Warwick & Associates. She has been there 11 years. She is calm in a way that I am calm. She does not raise her voice, she does not interrupt, and when something has gone wrong, she asks 1 or 2 questions and then waits for the answer. We have a son named Ryan, 16 years old, a sophomore at Mater Dei High School in Evansville, who plays baseball and is 6 inches taller than I was at his age, and who is, by Karen's assessment, going to be exactly the kind of man his father is, except taller. We do not have a pet. We have a small Cape Cod house in the Oakland neighborhood that we bought in 2012 for $186,000, and that is now, according to the county assessor, worth about $320,000. If you've ever had a 29-year-old MBA fire you with the phrase legacy infrastructure mindset, hit subscribe and stay with me. In April of 2025, Stuart Fisk's younger brother Nolan came to work for Meridian. Nolan was 29 years old. He had a finance degree from the University of South Carolina and a master's in business administration from the University of North Carolina's Keenan-Flagler Business School, class of 2024. He had spent 2 years before business school as a financial analyst at Arbor Point Capital, the same private equity firm that owned 40% of Meridian. Arbor Point is how Stuart had come to know him in any professional capacity. Before that, they had not seen each other more than 3 or 4 times a year at family gatherings. Stuart, at 48, with a wife and 2 daughters, and the only company he had ever built, trusted Nolan because Nolan was his brother, and because Nolan's Arbor Point track record looked good on paper. Nolan's title at Meridian was Chief Revenue and Innovation Officer. The role had been invented for him. He had never been in an industrial setting. He had never attended a refinery turnaround. He had never read the gasket design standards. He had never seen a gasket fail in service. He drove a leased BMW. He had moved to Evansville from Charlotte in March and was renting an apartment in a new-build complex on the east side that the locals had been calling the Glass Box since it opened the previous summer. His vocabulary in his first all-hands meeting included the phrases legacy infrastructure mindset, cloud-first alternatives, talent portfolio optimization, and innovation pipeline. I was sitting in the third row. I took notes. For 6 months, Nolan and I had perhaps a dozen interactions, none of them substantive. He sat in on a quarterly product development review in July. He asked one question about whether the database I maintained was scalable. I said it scaled to whatever account volume the company supported, which at that point was 168 active accounts and growing at about 4 per quarter. He nodded. He wrote something on his iPad. He did not follow up. In September of 2025, I sent him the second warning email about the database. I have already described his response. On Wednesday, October 22nd, 2025, at 4:30 in the afternoon, Nolan called me into the conference room adjacent to the executive suite on the second floor of the Covert Avenue building. The human resources director was already in the room, so was a manila folder on the table. I had not been told the subject of the meeting in the calendar invite. Nolan stood. He did not invite me to sit down. He said, "Dale, we've made some decisions about the future direction of the product development function. Your role is being transitioned to a more dynamic, growth-oriented function that requires a different profile. We're terminating your employment effective today. Severance is 12 weeks at base. The acknowledgement form is in the folder. We appreciate everything you've contributed to the legacy infrastructure here." He used the phrase legacy infrastructure twice in the 4-minute meeting. I sat down anyway. I read the acknowledgement form. I read the severance terms. I read the non-disparagement clause. I did not sign anything yet. I said, "Nolan, the Thursday morning production queue will need access to the customer specification database by 7 o'clock. The system requires my credentials. There is no other administrator account." He said, "We have it handled." I said, "Nolan, I sent you a written warning about this 6 weeks ago. I sent Stuart and Carolyn Ray a written warning about this 2.5 years ago. The database will lock when my credentials are revoked." He said, "Dale, we're evaluating cloud-first alternatives. We have it handled." I signed the acknowledgement. I picked up the folder. I walked back to my office. I packed 2 photographs, one of Karen and Ryan on a fishing trip at Patoka Lake in 2022, one of my parents at their 40th anniversary dinner in 2014, and a small Hilton hotel pen I had been carrying for 9 years because I liked the way it wrote. I left the rest of my desk untouched. The customer specification database access I had on my work laptop would be revoked by information technology within the hour, per standard termination protocol. I knew this because I had reviewed the termination protocol myself for Meridian's quality manual in 2019. I drove home in the Equinox. The drive from the Covert Avenue building to our house in Oakland takes 17 minutes when the lights cooperate. I made it in 18. Karen was in the kitchen when I came in the back door. She saw my face. I told her. I sat at the kitchen table. I drank a glass of water she set in front of me. Ryan was upstairs doing geometry. She said, "He hasn't been in this industry long enough to know what he doesn't know." I said, "He hasn't." She said, "Did you tell him about the database?" I said, "Twice, in writing, and then again in the termination meeting." She said, "Okay." We ate dinner at the kitchen table. Ryan came down at 6:30. He asked how the day went. I said it had been long. He said his geometry teacher had assigned an entire unit on conic sections over the weekend, and he wanted to know whether I remembered what a hyperbola was. I said I did. We worked through 3 problems at the table after dinner. I went to bed at 10. I slept fine. My phone buzzed at 7:15 on Thursday morning, October 23rd, 2025. I was in the kitchen making coffee. Karen was at the bathroom sink doing her makeup for her 8 o'clock day at the accounting firm. Ryan was eating cereal at the table. The phone was on the counter next to the coffee maker. The text was from Vera Holmberg. Vera is Meridian's production manager. She is 51 years old. She has been at Meridian since 2016. She and I had worked together every day for 9 years. Her text said, "All 3 3 database terminals showing authentication error. No spec sheets loaded for the morning queue. 11 active orders. Do you know what's happening? I read the text. I put the phone face down on the counter. I poured my coffee. I added a splash of cream. I sat at the kitchen table across from Ryan. He looked up from his cereal. He said, "Dad, your phone buzzed." I said, "I know." He said, "You're not going to look at it." I said, "Not yet." He went back to his cereal. I drank my coffee. Karen came down at 7:30. She poured herself coffee. She looked at the phone face down on the counter. She did not ask what was on the screen. She drank her coffee. She kissed Ryan on the top of the head. She kissed me on the cheek on her way out the back door at 7:52. I picked up the phone at 8. I read Vera's text again. I did not reply. I scrolled to my contacts. I called James Petro at Bamberger and Petro on Main Street downtown. James Petro is 55. He is a partner at a 4-attorney commercial litigation an employment firm in Evansville. He has been my attorney since 2015, when he handled an estate matter for my late uncle. He picked up his cell on the 3rd ring. He was already at his office. James is at his desk at 7:30 every morning. The courthouse is open. I told him what had happened at 4:30 Wednesday afternoon. I told him about Vera's 7:15 text. I told him about the 2 warning emails. I read him the dates from memory. James said, "Dale, do not respond to anyone at Meridian. Do not reply to Vera. Do not pick up if Nolan calls. Forward me both warning emails this morning and the Nolan response from September 21st. I will be in court until 11. After 11, I will draft a position memo we can use if they call asking for help." I said, "James, Vera is going to keep texting." He said, "Vera is doing her job. You are no longer her colleague. The way you help her now is by not creating an evidentiary mess. Forward the emails. Stay home today." I forwarded the emails at 8:15 from my personal account, which I had been using for the warning emails since the beginning because I wanted them on a system I would retain access to. James acknowledged receipt at 8:30. At 9 in the morning, Nolan's assistant, a young woman named Brett, 23 years old, 6 weeks into the job, emailed me from her work account. The email was 3 sentences. It said, "Hi Dale, we're trying to pull specification sheets for the production queue this morning, and the database appears to be experiencing an issue. Can you confirm the administrator credentials are still active? Thanks." I did not respond. At 9:20, Vera texted again. "Dale, please, we have a Phillips 66 order due to ship Monday. 8 gaskets. Can you call me?" I did not respond. I want to be clear about why I did not respond to Vera. Vera Holmberg had not done anything wrong. Vera had not fired me. Vera had not ignored my 2 warning emails. Vera had been on my side every working day for 9 years. The instruction from James Petro was that any communication from me on Thursday morning would be subject to discovery, would be evidence in a litigation matter I was now a party to, and could be used by Meridian's outside counsel to argue that I had been consulting informally on the system after my termination, which would muddy the question of whether the company had failed to act on documented warnings or had instead failed to manage a transition I was still actively supporting. Silence on Thursday morning was the cleanest move available to me. I owed it to James. I owed it to Karen. I owed it to whoever was going to ask me about this in a deposition room 6 weeks later. I owed it ultimately to Vera, because the cleanest possible record of what happened was the best protection for everyone in the building who had not made the decisions that produced this morning. I called Vera the following Tuesday afternoon at my house, on speakerphone, with James in the room. I told her I could not discuss the database or the access situation. I told her I was retaining counsel. I told her I was sorry. Vera said one sentence. She said, "Dale, I figured. I don't know what's going on up there, but I'm glad you're talking to a lawyer." She hung up. At 11, Vera made a decision with the production manager on shift, a man named Tony Marsh, who had been at Meridian for 14 years and who I had hired in 2018. Without the customer specification database, they ran the morning's Phillips 66 order from the most recent printed specification sheet they could find. The sheet was dated October 14th, 2024, 18 months old. It was the version of the spec that had been in the paper file before I processed a tolerance revision in March of 2025. The revision had narrowed the bore diameter tolerance on one specific Class 600 high-temperature steam service gasket from plus or minus 0.006 of an inch to plus or minus 3 thousandths. The revision had been requested by the Phillips 66 engineer who reviewed the original spec. The revision was documented in the database. It was not documented in the paper file. 2 gaskets were produced from the October 2024 specification on Thursday afternoon. The production team noticed nothing wrong because the gaskets matched the printed spec they had been handed. The gaskets went into the shipping queue Friday morning. I did not know any of this on Thursday or Friday. I did not know it until 10 days later, when James and I were preparing for a phone call with Phillips 66's outside counsel. On Friday afternoon, the gaskets shipped. The truck left the Covert Avenue dock at 2:15 p.m., Friday, October 24th. The shipment arrived at the Phillips 66 Rogers Creek refinery in southern Illinois at 9:11 a.m. on Monday, October 27th. Phillips 66's incoming inspection team measured the gaskets at the dock. 2 of the 8 measured 0.015 inches outside the current specification on bore diameter. The current specification is the March 2025 revision. The inspector, a man named Hank Whitmer, who had been doing dock inspections at Phillips 66 for 19 years, pulled the bad gaskets, flagged the shipment, and called his maintenance turnaround planner. The planner called Phillips 66's procurement office. Procurement called Meridian. Meridian's procurement side contact at the time, a woman named Adrienne McKee, 26 years old, 3 months in the role, took the call at 1:18 Monday afternoon. She did not understand the technical implications. She escalated to Vera Holmberg. Vera escalated to Tony Marsh. Tony Marsh escalated to Stuart Fisk. Stuart Fisk called Nolan Fisk at 3:14 Monday afternoon. I learned all of this on Tuesday, October 28th, when Meridian's outside counsel, a firm called Frost Brown Todd out of Louisville, with a partner named Keith Werner running the matter, emailed me. The email requested a technical consultation with me as a former employee with institutional knowledge of the customer specification database. James intercepted the email. James replied. He wrote that I would not be consulting informally with Meridian's outside counsel. Any formal engagement would require a written engagement letter, a defined scope of work, and an hourly rate negotiated in advance. He attached a draft engagement letter for reference. Keith Werner did not respond to the draft. Hank Whitmer, the Phillips 66 dock inspector who flagged the 2 bad gaskets at Rogers Creek, was a man I had spoken to on the phone perhaps 8 times over the years on technical questions about Meridian shipments. He was Air Force enlisted background, 20 years on a maintenance crew before he went into refinery inspection. The first thing he had done when he flagged the gaskets, before he called his maintenance turnaround planner, was to pull up the most recent specification on Phillips 66's vendor portal. The most recent specification was the March 2025 revision I had processed. He compared the measured bore diameter against the current spec. The variance was 0.015 inches. He measured each gasket twice with a digital caliper to make sure the variance was real. He took photographs of the digital caliper readings against each gasket. He sent the photographs to his planner. The planner sent them to procurement. Procurement sent them to Meridian. Adrienne McKee opened the email at 1:18 on Monday afternoon and saw the caliper readings and did not know what they meant because she had been at Meridian 3 months and had never seen a specification revision in the database, and she escalated to Vera with the right instinct of a young employee who knows when she is out of her depth. Stuart Fisk's first call after the Phillips 66 breach notice was to Nolan. The call lasted 4 minutes. I do not know what was said. I know it from Karen's friend Susan, who is a paralegal in the Evansville office of an unrelated firm that shares a parking garage with Meridian, who saw Nolan walking back to his office at 4:15 on Friday, November 6th, in a way that Susan described as the way a man walks when he has just been yelled at by his older brother for the first time in 20 years. The Phillips 66 turnaround at Rogers Creek began Monday, November 3rd. It was supposed to begin at 6 in the morning. It began at 5 p.m. on Thursday, November 6th, because Phillips 66 had to emergency source the 2 replacement gaskets from Parker Hannifin on a 72-hour rush fabrication. The rush cost $120,000 over Meridian's contracted price, and the 3-day turnaround delay cost Phillips 66 approximately $1.4 million in downstream production loss across the refinery's gasoline, and jet fuel output streams. On Friday, November 6, 2025, Phillips 66's procurement office issued a formal breach of contract notice to Meridian Sealing Technologies. The notice cited the failure to deliver specification-compliant gaskets by the contracted ship date and the resulting turnaround delay. The notice reserved Phillips 66's right to seek consequential damages. On Sunday, November 15th, AES Indiana, the utility company that operates several gas-fired power generation facilities in the central part of the state, filed a late delivery claim against Meridian on 4 separate orders that had been delayed by the database outage. The orders had been queued from Thursday, October 23rd through Friday, November 7th, and Meridian had not been able to produce specification sheets for any of them until I had been replaced, a process that took, as I had predicted in my July 2023 warning email, almost exactly 7 weeks. The AES claim totaled $380,000. Meridian's total exposure on the cascade, Phillips 66 breach notice plus AES claim plus 2 smaller customer claims that came in over the following 2 weeks, was approximately $6 million. The estimated legal cost was $870,000 more. The total estimated impact on the company, on a base of $87 million in annual revenue, was approaching $7 million. On Monday, December 1st, 2025, I was served a deposition subpoena at my home at 11:40 in the morning by a process server from a Vanderburgh County agency. The subpoena was in the matter of Phillips 66 Company versus Meridian Sealing Technologies, Inc. I was identified as the designer and sole administrator of the customer specification database, and as the author of the September 11, 2025 written warning, which Phillips 66's litigation team had obtained through discovery during the breach of contract proceedings. The lead attorney for Phillips 66 was a woman named Rachel Walsh, a partner at Bracewell in Houston. The deposition was scheduled for Wednesday, December 17, 2025 at 10 in the morning at the Bamberger and Petro conference room on Main Street in downtown Evansville. I called James from the kitchen as soon as the process server left. He said, "Dale, bring both warning emails, the Nolan response from September 21st, the system access logs, if you have copies, and your professional engineer's license documentation. I'll handle the rest." I said, "James, what about my contract with Apex Sealing Solutions in Chicago? They've made me an offer." He said, "Dale, sign it after the deposition, not before. We do not want the optics of you starting at a Meridian competitor while you are under subpoena in a case against Meridian." I said, "James, the offer is $235,000 base plus a $28,000 bonus target." He said, "Dale, it will still be there in 3 weeks. Sign it after the deposition." I told Karen at the kitchen table that night. She read the subpoena once. She set it down. She read it again. She set it down a second time. She said, "I'll come with you." I said, "Karen, you don't have to. James will be there. The deposition is technical. Bracewell will ask me about dates and protocols and bore tolerances. You'll be bored." She said, "Dale, I'm coming. I'm not going to be bored." I said, "Karen," she said, "I'm coming." She came. The deposition was on Wednesday, December 17, 2025 at 10 in the morning in the third-floor conference room at Bamberger and Petro on Main Street in downtown Evansville. Karen drove me. We parked in the structure on Sycamore Street at 9:30. We walked the 2 blocks to the firm in a cold December rain that had been falling since before sunrise. I was wearing a dark gray suit I had bought for my father's brother's funeral in 2019 and worn 3 times since. Karen was wearing a navy blazer over a cream blouse and dark slacks. We did not say much on the walk. She held my arm. The conference room had a polished oak table that seated 12. James Petro was already there. The court reporter, a woman named Diane who had been doing depositions in southern Indiana since the early 2000s, was setting up her stenotype machine at the head of the table. Rachel Walsh, lead counsel for Phillips 66, walked in at 9:52. Accompanied by a junior associate from Bracewell's Houston office. Keith Werner, lead counsel for Meridian Sealing Technologies, walked in at 9:56, accompanied by his own junior associate from Frost Brown Todd's Louisville office. Stuart Fisk walked in at 9:58. I had not seen Stuart in 7 weeks. He had aged. He was wearing a charcoal suit and a tie that did not match. He nodded at me as he sat down in the observer section at the back of the room. He did not say anything. I nodded back. The deposition began at 10:02. James Petros stated his appearance for the record. Keith Werner stated his appearance. Rachel Walsh stated her appearance. The court reporter swore me in. Rachel Walsh opened her binder. The exchange that mattered ran about 14 minutes in the transcript. I have read it 3 times since. Rachel Walsh asked clean questions in a measured voice. She did not raise her voice. She did not perform. She had brought every document she needed, and she knew where each one was in her binder. She had clearly read the September 11th, 2025 warning email more times than I had. She said, "Mr. Schreiner, did you at any point notify your employer that the customer specification database would become inaccessible upon your departure without a credentialed administrator?" I said, "Yes, I notified them in writing on July 18th, 2023, and again on September 11th, 2025. She said, "To whom was the September 11th notice addressed?" I said, "Nolan Fisk, Chief Revenue and Innovation Officer, Stuart Fisk, Chief Executive Officer, and the Information Technology Director, Carolyn Ray." She said, "Did you receive a substantive response indicating the issue would be addressed before your departure?" I said, "No." Mr. Nolan Fisk responded on September 21st that the company was evaluating cloud-first alternatives. No corrective action was taken before my termination. She said, "On the date of your termination, did you advise anyone at Meridian that the database would be inaccessible the following morning?" I said, "Yes, I told Nolan Fisk directly in the termination meeting on the afternoon of October 22nd that the Thursday production queue would require database access by 7 in the morning and that the system required my credentials." She said, "What was his response?" I said, "We have it handled." She said, "Were the out-of-specification gaskets manufactured using a current specification sheet?" I said, "No, they were manufactured using a specification sheet dated October 14th, 2024 that had been superseded in March of 2025. The current specification was in the customer specification database, which was inaccessible to Meridian on Thursday morning." She said, "What was the specific revision in the March 2025 update?" I said, "The bore diameter tolerance was tightened from plus or minus 0.06 of an inch to plus or minus 0.03. The revision had been requested by the Phillips 66 process engineer who reviewed the original specification." She said, "Is the application in which these gaskets were ordered, ASME Class 600 high-temperature steam service, a safety-critical application?" I said, "Yes. Per the Petroleum Industry Pipe Flange Connections Standard, a gasket failure in Class 600 steam service at the operating temperatures specified in Phillips 66's purchase order would be classified as a safety event with potential for serious personnel injury." She said, "Thank you, Mr. Schreiner. Mr. Werner, your witness." Keith Werner asked me 8 questions. He asked whether I had been compensated by Phillips 66 or its counsel for my testimony. I said no. He asked whether I had been promised future employment by any party as a result of my testimony. I said no. He asked whether I had any personal animus toward Meridian Sealing Technologies. I said no. He asked whether I had any personal animus toward Nolan Fisk. I said no. He asked whether I had any personal animus towards Stuart Fisk. I said no, and I looked at Stuart in the back row when I said it. Keith asked 4 more questions, mostly about the technical structure of the database, which I answered in the same flat register I had used with Rachel Walsh. The deposition concluded at 11:18. Diane, the court reporter, packed up her machine. Rachel Walsh shook my hand. She said, "Mr. Schreiner, thank you for your time." I said, "Of course." Keith Werner did not shake my hand. He left first. Stuart Fisk stayed in his chair at the back of the room for about 45 seconds after the others had left. Then he stood up. He walked to where I was still sitting. He held out his hand. I stood and shook it. He said, "Dale, I should have read the September email." I said, "Stuart, I sent it to you and Carolyn and Nolan." He said, "I know. That was the conversation." Karen and I walked back to the parking structure in the same rain that was now an hour into being heavier than it had been when we walked in. She held my arm again. She did not say anything until we were in the car. She started the engine. She let it warm up. The wipers ran on intermittent for the first cycle. She watched the front windshield clear. She said, "Dale, you did not gloat." I said, "I had nothing to gloat about." She said, "That's why you did not gloat. Most men in that room would have." I said, "James told me not to." James said the deposition was a documentary exercise. He said the goal was to put dates and document numbers on the record, and to do it in a voice the court reporter could transcribe without having to slow me down. He said the case would be settled in 6 weeks, and the settlement number would be larger if my testimony read clean. He told me on the phone Friday night that he would prefer if I sounded like a chemical engineer reading test results. She said, "You sounded like a chemical engineer reading test results." I said, "Good." She said, "Stuart shook your hand." I said, "He did." She said, "What did he say?" I told her. She drove home. The rain came harder. We did not say anything for the last 15 minutes of the drive. Karen put a hand on my knee when we pulled into our driveway. She did not need to. Ryan was at school. The house was quiet. I changed out of the suit. I hung the suit in the closet. I did not know when I would wear it again. I put on a sweatshirt and jeans. I went down to the kitchen. Karen had put on a pot of coffee. We sat at the table and drank coffee in silence for about 20 minutes. Then Karen got up and went to her home office and started on a tax return file she had brought home for a small business client. I went out to the garage and reorganized a shelf of half-empty paint cans that had been bothering me since the fall. Phillips 66 and Meridian Sealing Technologies settled the breach of contract matter on Tuesday, January 13, 2026 for $4,100,000. The AES Indiana late delivery claim was settled the same week for $380,000. Two smaller customer claims, one from a chemical processing plant in Henderson, Kentucky, and one from a power generation operator in southern Illinois, settled in the following 10 days for a combined $1.4 million. Total direct settlement exposure, approximately $5.9 million. Meridian's legal costs across the four matters ran to $870,000. Total impact on the company, approximately $6.7 million on an $87 million revenue base. Nolan Fisk's role at Meridian Sealing Technologies was eliminated by the company's board on Tuesday, January 20, 2026. The board notification was a one-paragraph internal email that did not name a reason. He did not contest the elimination. He left the building Tuesday afternoon. He updated his professional networking profile within 48 hours to read Independent Business Strategy Advisor and Independent Innovation Consultant. Stuart Fisk did not make a public statement about the elimination. Stuart and Nolan did not speak for 4 months after the deposition. They spoke for the first time at their mother's birthday in May. I learned this much later from Vera, who learned it from Brett, who learned it from Nolan's wife at a gym in Evansville. I accepted the offer from Apex Sealing Solutions in Chicago on Tuesday, January 27, 2026. Senior Applications Engineer, base salary $235,000, annual bonus target $28,000, total target compensation $263,000. My Meridian salary had been $118,000. The role required 2 to 3 days a month in Chicago and was otherwise home-based, with travel to customer sites for technical reviews and turnaround inspections. The travel was the part I cared about. The salary was a number Karen had computed at the kitchen table the night before I accepted, working out the seller financed mortgage we had on the Oakland house and the college savings we would now be able to add to for Ryan, and she had handed me the page with a small underline at the bottom and said, "Dale, take it." I took it. The customer specification database migration at Meridian, the project I had requested in July 2023 and again in September 2025 for an estimated cost of approximately $85,000, was completed under emergency contract by a database consulting firm in Evansville called Whitford Data Group. The completion date was Tuesday, February 3, 2026. The cost was $340,000. The contracted timeline was 5 weeks. The actual timeline was 7 weeks. I do not know who at Meridian negotiated the contract. I do not know who at Whitford Data Group ran the project. I do not need to know. On Thursday, March 12, 2026, at 6:30 in the morning, I was on site at a refinery maintenance facility in East Chicago, Indiana, for Apex Sealing Solutions, for a planned maintenance turnaround inspection on a unit operated by a regional refining company that contracts with Apex for its custom gasket needs. I was wearing a Tyvek suit and safety glasses and a hard hat. The morning was cold. The refinery was lit by sodium vapor lamps that turn everything the color of old amber. The flare stack on the east side of the property was burning a low blue flame The plant maintenance engineer running the turnaround was a man named Bill Stevens, 47 years old, who had been at the refinery for 21 years and at this same maintenance position for 9. He had a flange assembly open on a 12-inch high-temperature steam line. The flange faces were clean. The fasteners were laid out on a clean canvas to his left in the order he intended to torque them. The replacement gasket was a spiral wound metallic per the relevant section of the gasket design code, class 600, with the correct bore diameter and the correct surface finish, and the markings I had verified that morning at 6 against the specification sheet Apex's quality system had generated for me at 5:45. I had met Bill Stevens for the first time at 6:15 that morning in the contractor sign-in trailer. He had read my Apex Sealing Solutions credentials. He had looked at the specification sheet on my clipboard. He had asked me one question. He had asked whether I had been at the deposition in Evansville in December. I said yes. He said he had read the trade press article in February. He said his old company had bought from Meridian for 12 years and had quietly moved its business to a Pittsburgh-based competitor in the first week of November. He said, "Dale, good to have you here." That was the entire conversation we had had before we walked out to the flange. Bill Stevens held the gasket up. He said, "Dale, confirm the markings." I read the markings. They matched the specification sheet on my clipboard. I said, "Confirmed." Bill set the gasket on the lower flange face. He aligned it. The technician on his crew began torquing the fasteners in the cross pattern the standard called for. I noted the torque values on the inspection form on the clipboard. I noted the time. I noted the gasket batch number from the markings. I dated and initialed the form. I handed it to Bill. Bill said, "Thanks, Dale." I said, "You're welcome." We walked to the next flange. Sometimes a database doesn't fail loudly. It fails because the man who built it isn't there to log in on Thursday morning. If you got something out of this story, hit that like button and let me know in the comments what part stayed with you. If you haven't subscribed yet, go ahead and subscribe and ring the notification bell so the next one shows up. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.